Hey everybody, welcome back. Hopefully you had a productive discussion following session 2. In session 2, we introduced the first of our 5 questions, and the question was, am I being honest with myself? Really, am I being honest with myself? Really? So I hope you have been more honest with yourself, really. And I hope you've had an opportunity to do some preparation for this session where we're going to introduce our second question, the legacy question. And the legacy question is, what story do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? And the good news is, to a large extent, you get to decide. But you decide one decision at a time because you write the story of your life one decision at a time. Every decision, think about this, every decision you make becomes a permanent part of your story, the story of your life. And every decision you make has an outcome, a consequence, a result. It may be good, it may be bad, it may be desirable or undesirable, expected or unexpected, whatever the case, that outcome becomes a permanent part of your story as well. Your boss asked you to lie to the client. You lied to the client called you on it. Your boss blamed you and you lost your job. Now, part of your story is that you lied and lost your job. Your friends wanted to go out. You had an exam to study for. You said no to your friends. You aced the exam. And now you have a diploma to show for it. Every decision and the outcome of those decisions become a permanent part of the story, which is the story of your life, which means, think about this, which means decision by decision, you are writing the story of your life. That's why when you're making a decision of any magnitude, of any significance, you should pause, look ahead, and ask, what story do I want to tell? When this is nothing more than a story I tell, what story do I want to tell? Think about it. The decisions that you're in the middle of making right now, are going to be nothing more than a story you tell someday. What story do you want to tell? Now, chances are you've never really thought of your life as a story, and most people don't, but it is. Perhaps you lost your job recently. Surviving this season without a job is going to be a story you tell someday. What story do you want to tell? I lost my job. I was so embarrassed. I started drinking. I racked up a ton of debt. I lost the respect of my friends. I lost the respect of my wife and my kids. It's not a good story. Or what about this? You're dating someone and things are going really well, but there's someone else at the office and yeah, she's married, but you find yourself gravitating in her direction and she seems to be gravitating in yours as well. Next thing you know, you're on a business trip together and she's made it clear that she's willing if you're willing, and well, the decision you make becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. What story do you want to tell? I got involved with a woman at work, lied to my girlfriend, busted up her home. Now her kids ping pong between 2 families on the weekends. Is that the story you want to tell? So again, we don't generally think of our lives as stories, but they're stories, and our stories are decided one decision at a time. Now, I know we've never met, but here's something I know about you. You'd like to be able to tell your entire story without skipping any chapters or having to lie about any details, right? I mean, someday you'd like to be able to sit down with your kids or maybe your grandkids or maybe someone you hope to spend the rest of your life with and tell your entire story. You'd like to be the hero in your story. I mean, we all want to be the hero in our story, right? And going forward, you can have that, but it will require for you to stop mid-decision and ask our question. What story do I want to tell? Which of my available options do I want as a permanent part of my story? Now, one of the reasons we don't think about our story when we're making decisions is we get distracted. We get distracted by the pressure and the emotions of the moment, right? I mean, emotion is like a fog. It causes us to lose sight of the broader context of our story. And you know how this works. You're up against a deadline. You've got to decide, and you've got to decide soon. You've been dating someone for a long time, and suddenly he or she calls the question and says, hey, if you don't marry me, I'm leaving. And well, nobody wants to be left. Or maybe you didn't make your quota and your boss has told you if you don't make your quota, you're fired, and nobody wants to be fired. I mean, when you're forced to make a decision under pressure, it's hard to think about tomorrow, much less your story, right? You've got to get through today. So whether it's love or lust or greed or jealousy or fear, emotions always complicate the process by focusing our attention on the immediate rather than the ultimate, rather than our story. We're left thinking in terms of our options, our choices, but not our story. Here's another angle. Isn't it true that our worst decisions were fueled by something with strong emotional appeal? That weekend, that first marriage, that purchase, that lease. It was so appealing, you bought it. It was so appealing, you ate it. It was so appealing, you dated it, you moved in with it. It was so appealing, you took it, you smoked it. I could go on and on and on, right? And the reason we have regrets, the reason we look back and wonder, what was I thinking, is that there was something with strong emotional appeal involved. If you're in retail sales, you get this, right? The worst thing you can do is let a potential customer what? Leave the store or leave the showroom without making the sale. Once they walk out, what happens? Well, the emotion attached to whatever it was they were looking at, it begins to fade. They gain perspective. They are far less likely to make the purchase. Experts tell us that once our appetites are engaged in the decision-making process, we fall victim to a cognitive bias labeled focalism. You may have heard of this, focalism. If you've ever been in love, you've been a victim of focalism. And this is why, guys, the first time you fell in love, you remember this, all you could see was her. Everything and everybody else just faded into the background. Remember that car that you got your sights set on and your emotions engaged with? Once you decided which car you wanted, you saw it everywhere. Why? Because we hyper-focus. While the big picture, the story, it's the furthest thing from our minds. Again, in an emotionally charged decision-making environment, we think in terms of choices, not stories. And that's why our second question is so powerful. It empowers us to put the decision-making process within the broader context of the story of our lives. What story do I want to tell? Now, obviously, we're not the first generation to wrestle with this. There's a well-known story in the Hebrew Bible that serves, I think, as a perfect illustration of this principle. Around 1850 BC, a 17-year-old young man named Joseph, one of 12 sons, finds himself in a really tough spot. You're probably familiar with Joseph's story. His father, Jacob, loved him more than his brothers, his older brothers, because Joseph was the favorite son of the favorite wife. Another story for another day, right? Eventually, the jealousy of his older brothers gets the best of them, and they decide to kill Joseph. In the end, they lose their nerve, and they decide instead to sell Joseph. Way more profitable, a bit more merciful. They sell him to slave traders, and then they tell their parents that he was killed by a wild animal. And now these 10 young men, these 10 older brothers, have a secret they're forced to live with for the rest of their lives. Now they are liars for life. And that's not a good story. Their story was, I was jealous of my younger brother, so I sold him. I broke my father's heart. Please, and we'll come back to this, please never, never, never make a decision that makes you a liar for life. Don't decide anything that makes you a liar for life. Anyway, back to Joseph. Joseph ends up on the auction block in Egypt, where he's purchased by a military officer named Potiphar. And now Joseph has a decision to make. Do I run? Do I do what most slaves do, which is as little as possible with as bad an attitude as I can get by with? Or do I throw myself into this slave thing with everything I've got? Now, this is a really interesting dilemma for a rich kid who grew up as his father's favorite son from his father's favorite wife, right? Well, Joseph, as you may know, decides to serve Potiphar's household as if it were his own. And before long, Potiphar notices and he gives Joseph more and more responsibility. And eventually, Joseph ends up running Potiphar's entire household. Now, that's a story worth telling, isn't it? I was kidnapped once. I was sold twice. I was a victim, but I decided not to live like a victim. That was Joseph's story. But then, as you probably know, his story intersects with somebody else's story. In spite of Joseph's diligence, actually because of Joseph's diligence, he's forced into really a no-win situation when his master's wife insists that he become her lover. Now, Joseph has two options, neither of which are going to have a good outcome. He's probably maybe 19 or 20 years old by this time. He's far from home. And this isn't primarily a moral issue. This is a life or death issue. It's more like death or death issue. He could lose his life either way he decides. But he took the high road and he chose to tell Potiphar's wife no. Now, it's at this juncture in the story that Joseph employs a really powerful technique, something actually that we should all mimic. Joseph rehearses his story out loud as the context for his response and his answer to Potiphar's wife. This is how we know that he was deciding within the broader context of his personal story. You should read the whole story for yourself, but I'll paraphrase the first part of his answer, and then I'll read specifically what he said. Here's the paraphrase version. Mrs. Potiphar, I came to this land as a slave. I had no rights and I had no future, and your husband purchased me. He treated me with kindness, and I did my best to serve him and his family. I've worked hard. I've done everything required of me, and with my God's help, I've worked my way to the point where your husband trusts me. Look, he's put me in charge of his entire household. And then he says to her, and I quote, he says, with me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. Implication is this, Mrs. Potiphar, this is your story. You really need to think about this. Do you want an affair with a Hebrew slave as part of your story? And then Joseph steps back into the broadest context of all. Mrs. Potiphar, in light of your husband's confidence in me and God's mercy to me, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? In other words, why would I want to add adultery to what's turning out to be a really good story with an ending I never dreamed possible? What story would I rather tell? Story number one. Your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way, so I was faithful to him, and I was faithful to my God who's been watching out for me. Or story number two, your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way, so I took advantage of his kindness and his trust and had an affair with his wife. So Joseph did the right thing. But if you know this story, you know that things did not turn out right. She accuses him of trying to rape her, and Joseph ends up in Pharaoh's dungeon. But as you probably remember, Joseph's story isn't over. And here's what I want to say to you. And neither is yours. Neither is yours. The season you're in right now is a chapter of your story. It is not the entire story, even though it may feel that way. More on that later. Anyway, back to Joseph. While he's in prison, Joseph does the very same thing he did in Potiphar's household. He does his very best. He decides well, and over time, he wins the trust of the prison warden. Before long, he's pretty much running the place. And this goes on for several years. And don't let that go by too quickly. Several years this chapter went on in his life. But several years later, he's ushered into Pharaoh's presence to interpret a dream that Pharaoh had that he was absolutely confident had something to do with him and something to do with the nation. None of his magicians are able to interpret the dream. And then in another surprising move, Joseph assures Pharaoh that he can't interpret the dream either, but that God could. God is in the Hebrew God. Fortunately for Joseph, Pharaoh is more curious than furious, and he lets Joseph continue. And here's what Joseph tells him, that Egypt would experience 7 years of record grain harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. In fact, the famine would be so bad that everyone would forget about the 7 good years. And then Joseph does the unthinkable. He actually gives Pharaoh unsolicited advice. Nobody does this, but Joseph did. And here's what he said. He said, Pharaoh, you need to choose someone you trust and put them in charge of purchasing grain for the next 7 years, and then give them the responsibility for distributing the grain during the lean years. Pharaoh is so impressed. And in a move that shocked everybody in the throne room that afternoon, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge. He makes him the prime minister of Egypt. And once again, Joseph decides well and devotes himself to this unprecedented opportunity. 7 years later, famine devastates that region of the world. Joseph opens up the grain silos, and before long, people are coming from all over the world to buy grain from the Egyptians, including Joseph's brothers. Now, if you've never actually read this story, you really owe it to yourself to read this section in particular. It is so interesting, and there are so many details I have to skip. But here's what happens in the end. In the end, Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers, and of course, they are appropriately terrified. And they're terrified because they assume Joseph is going to do to them what they had done to him, but possibly worse. I mean, he's the prime minister of Egypt. He can do anything he wants to. But Joseph wasn't anything like his brothers. Joseph had decided many years earlier to create a different narrative for his life, to decide in a different direction, to write a different kind of story, a story worth telling, and he didn't want revenge to be part of that story. So In addition to rescuing the nation from the devastating famine, Joseph rescued his brothers and their families. He moved them all to Egypt, where they settled as the guests and relatives of the prime minister of Egypt. Now, here's the thing. The reason we know this remarkable story is because of Joseph's decisions. His decisions made it a story worth telling. Little did he know that 3,500 years later, we would still be telling his story. So, what story do you want to tell? What story do you want told about you? Like Joseph, like his brothers, you are writing your story one decision at a time. So don't ever make a decision. Please don't ever make a decision that will make you a liar for life, because long after whatever you gained is gone, you'll be left with your lie. You'll be left with a story you won't be proud to tell. Every relational, every financial, every professional decision, and the outcomes of those decisions become a permanent part of your story. So, as we wrap up, I want to challenge you to make yet another decision, the legacy decision. And the legacy decision is this: I will decide a story I am proud to tell. I will decide a story I'm proud to tell. A story I would be proud to have told about me. I will not decide anything that makes me a liar for life. Every decision you make becomes a permanent part of your story, the story of your life. What story do you want to tell? What story do you want told about you? Here's the great news. You get to decide, but you decide one decision at a time, because you write the story of your life one decision at a time. So, write a good one. We'll pick it up right there next time in session 4, where we look at the conscience question. And now, it's your turn to talk. Enjoy the discussion.